I have to admit, I was really looking forward to this one. It's going to be focused on energy decision-making in light of the new administration, how things will work together between FERC, DOE, and the National Energy Dominance Council. And for this one, we've got a really terrific panel of Washington savants who will help us try to figure out how to navigate our way through all of these new leadership in these organizations going forward. And to help moderate our panel today, we have Zack Hale. Zack is the Federal Energy Policy Reporter for S&P Global Commodity Insight. And Zack has been a frequent participant and attendee at WIRE's meetings. So we're happy to have him here and help lead the panel through the discussion. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Zack. He can introduce our all-star panel for this session. And I didn't bring my little magic globe for people to look through and predict the future. So we're going to have to rely on these three to tell us what to expect. All right, Zack, take it away.
Check, check. Okay, great. Good late morning to everyone. It's great to be back here at WIRE's again. I was just telling some other folks at dinner last night that WIRE's is one of my very favorite industry events to come to. You guys get in quick, you choose great locations, and then you get out, and it's just very refreshing, especially coming off of a 5-day energy conference in Houston last month. So, as mentioned, I'm a reporter with S&P Global Platts. We're a division within the broader S&P Global brand, which also does, as I'm sure you know, ratings and indices such as the S&P 500, which I looked at this morning, and probably not going to look at that for the rest of the day. Anyway, so getting down to business here. The last time I moderated a WIRE's panel was 2 years ago. FERC actually was holding a monthly open meeting at the same time I was moderating my panel, where they announced Order 2023. Some of you are probably familiar with that one, and quite a lot has changed since then. We have a new presidential administration with a new set of policy priorities, but at the same time, some things really have not changed that much at all since then. We're still seeing a massive need to expand the U.S. transmission system. I often like to cite from the 2023 DOE National Transmission Needs Study. Just some top-line figures from that. We have an estimated regional transmission need of a 64% increase by 2035. And the study also estimates we'll need to increase interregional transmission by 114% by 2035. And those estimates are probably outdated given all of the new projected demand that we're seeing from artificial intelligence data centers. Another figure I like to cite is PJM's latest demand growth projections. PJM is expecting its summer peak capacity, peak demand to climb from 154 gigawatts now to 220 gigawatts over the next 15 years. That's a 42% increase in load growth. So with all of that said, I think we have a really timely panel teed up for you here today. We're going to be looking at the DOE, its relationship with FERC, the two agencies' kind of evolving roles that we're seeing, as well as the President's National Energy Dominance Council, which he announced in February. So just quickly to set the stage, I'm going to go over 4 executive orders that I think are particularly relevant to the discussion today. As I'm sure most of you are aware, on January 20th, the president signed, he declared a national energy emergency. That executive order, it essentially just directed federal agencies to use existing emergency authorities to boost U.S. energy production, including the expedited approval of key projects. And then the same day, President Trump, he also signed an order on unleashing American energy. That order rescinded about a dozen Biden executive orders on energy and climate, and then it also directed DOE to pause new loan and grant approvals for projects funded under the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and Inflation Reduction Act. On February 14th, the president signed an executive order establishing the National Energy Dominance Council. The council itself is made up of about a dozen members of the president's cabinet, including the Secretary of State, for example, and it's led by Interior Secretary Doug Burgum and co-chaired by Energy Secretary Chris Wright. And then a few days later, President Trump also he issued an executive order claiming White House authority over independent agencies like FERC. So we'll be diving into all of those today. So just quickly to introduce our panelists here, we've got Craig Glazer, Vice President of Federal Policy for the PJM Interconnection, the Mid-Atlantic's 13-state grid operator and wholesale power market operator. We've got Norman Bay. Norman was previously chairman of FERC and is now a partner at Willkie. And then to our left here, we have Maria Robinson, former inaugural director of the Grid Deployment Office. And so, yeah, we're going to dive into the discussion here. And my first question will be for you, Maria. Can you just explain how DOE's role has evolved over the last 4 years as a traditional R&D focused agency?
Sure. So, and this is like the funniest thing to have this panel immediately after Aubrey's like, you can't tell anything about future behavior looking at past data, and that's, of course, sort of exactly what we're doing here. So that was a lovely tee up for this. But I do think that there's a lot of lessons to be learned about how nimble and how the relationships between different government functions can change. Sometimes we get it into our head that like, this is exactly what FERC does, and this is exactly what DOE does, and those things can evolve over time. And I think we saw that during the Biden administration in particular. Secretary Granholm was given this task to take us from being a very heavily R&D type agency where it's just, we're working at the national laboratories, we are trying to solve for fusion, right? The types of things that folks here who are in the actual building stuff parts of the world didn't interact with that much. And I think that was part of why everyone in DC was running around like chickens with their heads cut off for 4 years trying to figure out how you actually get money from the Department of Energy, because it wasn't really that common for that to happen, especially at the scale at which we were talking in the billions of dollars. And so in creating this, infrastructure arm of the Department of Energy, suddenly we start to look a little bit more like a place like the Department of Transportation. I think when I think about the different ways in which, we're trying to evolve over time, the Department of Transportation is actually a really interesting corollary for the Department of Energy, right? One of the areas where, we think about highway funding all the time as one of those things that people just pay for. We don't really think about it. And a lot of that comes from the federal government. And yet our wire system goes through the ratepayer side of things. And so that is a whole different type of funding mechanism where the federal government hasn't traditionally played a very significant role, either in giving money down to states to work on that infrastructure or to individual projects through competitive grants. And so we really entered into that sphere I'd say especially on the transmission side of things. Obviously, in the previous administration, unlocking access to renewables was a very major part of the overall initiative, but at the same time, solving for all of the basic, resilience and reliability problems that we were talking about here and still persist in 2025. So I think that continued evolution of the Department of Energy will continue over time. And we're likely to see that in other agencies as well. One of the things that I tell folks is, in the Obama era, I think EPA was probably the most exciting place to work, just because there was so much going on there. In the Biden era, it really seems like the Department of Energy was the place. And if I had to put my money on it today, I'd tell you Interior might be the next place where I think the permitting conversation really has to come to a head at some point in the relatively near future, just because that is a continued source of difficulty when trying to build things and build them quickly, whether it's in the electricity industry or in something else.
And
Yeah, what I would say is that I was very lucky during Secretary Granholm's tenure as the Secretary of DOE to be a member of her advisory board. And so I can tell you that she personally understood the importance of transmission and recognized that for the grid of the future, the United States needed to dramatically build up its transmission system. And the big change, I think, that happened at DOE was that, as Maria noted, it used to be very heavy on research and development, primarily through the national labs. And it also took care of nuclear weapons, right? And in terms of its interfacing with industry, that was much more limited. It might occur through the Loan Program Office or through ARPA-E for early stage startups. But during the Biden administration, with the passage of the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, as well as the Inflation Reduction Act, DOE suddenly got programmatic authority for literally hundreds of billions of dollars of federal support for the grid and for the energy industry generally, right? And so that really transformed DOE in terms of its role in the energy space. I mean, I used to think of, and this is probably very parochial of me, back from my days at FERC, is FERC really kind of calling the shots on energy policy. I think to some extent that changed during the Biden administration because it suddenly had funding, right? And it could do all kinds of amazing things through its national labs in terms of the research. So the question now is going to be, does that model continue under the Trump administration? You could see an argument to be made that it should, because if you're trying to drive energy dominance, then you want to make sure that DOE is best positioned to support the energy industry, right? On the other hand, you could see a countervailing force where some are saying, well, look, what we really need to do is scale back the scope of government and government's involvement with industry and even the federal workforce. So I think this will have to play out over the next few years for us to get a sense for what happens to the change that occurred during the Biden administration. And also let me give a shout out then not only to Secretary Granholm, but also to Maria, because she was head of the Grid Deployment Office and truly helped drive that agenda at the Department of Energy.
Thanks, Norman.
And Norman, just as a quick follow-up, can you just kind of describe the historical relationship between the DOE and FERC, and then can you also just kind of briefly describe what the executive order for independent agencies actually does?
Yeah, I mean, so this is a really interesting issue, right? Because there's a spectrum of possibilities in terms of what the relationship should be between FERC and the Department of Energy. If you go back to the Energy Organization Act of 1978, which created DOE and which created the modern-day FERC, it used to be the Federal Power Commission, DOE was given the statutory authority to file proposed rulemakings with FERC. Why is that significant? Because it was a proposed rulemaking, right? DOE could not tell FERC what to do. So the original Energy Organization Act recognized that FERC should be an independent agency, a technical agency with a president able to pick 3 members of the commission from the president's party and the 2 other commissioners coming from a different party. and with commissioners getting a 5-year term and only being removable for cause. So that was the way in which Congress contemplated the structuring of the relationship between DOE and FERC. But that doesn't have to be the only way one structures that relationship, right? You could create a situation in which FERC is much more beholden either to the Department of Energy or even to the White House, the Office of Management and Budget, or some other federal agency. And so the question there is going to be, how does that relationship develop under the Trump administration? I can tell you that when I was the chairman of FERC, the Obama administration was very, very careful and cautious about doing anything that was viewed as telling FERC what to do. And so my interaction with both DOE and the White House was extremely limited. And there were even meetings that I had where the person on the other side would say, look, we aren't telling FERC what to do. We recognize that you're an independent agency, right? So that's one approach where you fully recognize the independence of FERC given the way in which it was created and its statutory authority. At the other end of the spectrum, one can question the very existence of independent agencies. And that, in fact, is what is happening. The executive order, I think, is really the tip of the iceberg because that basically says that rulemakings have to be submitted to OMB for review, right? It doesn't actually say what OMB does once it reviews the rulemaking. I suppose implicit in the executive order is the notion that OMB, if it doesn't like the order, could basically tell FERC not to approve it, right? But that's not really said on the face of the executive order. I think much more important, actually, is not the executive order, but the litigation that's now happening over independent commissions. Because as you know, the Trump administration recently removed two of the Democrats on the Federal Trade Commission and previously had removed a head of the NLRB as well as someone from the Merits Protection Board, right? And the argument there is that if you restrict the president's ability to remove federal officials, that it impinges upon the president's removal authority under the Constitution. It creates a separation of powers concern. This all goes back to a case which you've probably read about in the newspapers called Humphrey's Executor, and whether that is still good law or not. So far, actually, the Trump administration gained a partial victory in the D.C. Circuit in a 2-to-1 vote, where, according to the majority, it was likely that the Trump administration would prevail in its efforts to remove the head of the Civil Protection Board, Civil Service Merits Protection Board, as well as a member of the NLRB. And of course, there's litigation ongoing regarding the members of the FTC. And so what could happen is that if the president has the authority to remove members of the FTC, I would think there is nothing that would constrain the president from removing members of FERC if the president so desired. And so that's kind of the larger issue, I think, out there beyond the executive orders themselves. Speaking for myself, having been at FERC at a time when it was truly recognized as an independent technical agency where more than 99% of our orders were issued unanimously. And it was actually more common to see disagreements among the Democrats than it was between the Democrats as a bloc and the Republicans, right? I mean, that was the world I came from. But I think that was really important for FERC's authority, for its legitimacy, for the regulatory stability and certainty it provided to industry. And so what I hope does not happen at FERC is that you get a revolving door of commissioners based upon changes in presidential administrations.
Norman, remind me, because I can't remember everything all the time. Is it in statute that it has to be 3 from one party and 2 from another?
I think so,
Okay,
yes.
so that could be like another interesting hook of potential changes that you see moving forward.
More than 3 from one party.
No more
Right.
than 3 from one party. Got it.
Yeah.
And 3 for a quorum. Right. Craig, anything to add on that? Or?
Wow, there's a lot here. So I'm from a lowly RTO.
Yeah,
We're feeling very unloved as people these days.
The most exciting place to be, come on.
I like to tell people working for an RTO is like being the chief groundskeeper at a cemetery. I got a lot of people under me, but I'm not sure if anybody's listening. So a little bit of where we're at here. But I think the number one issue is somebody's got to set the policy. And it has been split very much over the years between DOE and FERC and waxed and waned. And I think FERC could be maybe the right place to do that, but it is burdened with all of this legal process that I think really does get in the way of, working through issues, communicating with the industry, being nimble. I used to be a state regulator, and I used to plead with my staff, we need to be nimble. We need to get decisions out. We need to talk to people. We need to understand what's going on. But all the legal trappings get in the way of that. So I'm almost somewhat indifferent whether it's between FERC or DOE, as much as there needs to be some clarity that some policy is being set. And I think that's sort of the biggest challenge. And I'll just add, in most countries, this really does work different than it does in that there's usually a ministry of energy that is setting the policy, and the regulator has a much more limited role. Here in the US, we've sort of inverted that over the years, where the regulator has the chief role, which is okay if they can be nimble. And is no fault of their own, but it is very difficult with all the legal process, the ex parte rules, the proceedings, et cetera, to take a judicial model and apply it to nimble policymaking. So I think we just got to figure that out.
Norman?
So let me raise a defense for not being nimble. And the argument I would make is that process gives stakeholders the opportunity to be heard. And if you go through a FERC order where they're summarizing every stakeholder's position, you know that FERC is considering those views. And when you're looking at an industry where regulatory certainty is at a premium because of the capital-intensive nature of the investments, with some of these investments costing billions of dollars, the last thing you want is policy going up and down or zigzagging like crazy, right?
But it has. I'm sorry, but it has. With different FERC chairs, it has. So theoretically, you're right, but we've had FERC chairs that have written orders doing all that summary and coming out with very different conclusions. So, sorry to interrupt, but trying to make it live.
You sound kind of bitter.
A lot of history.
If I may say.
Not at you, not at you.
Oh, good. I'm glad you made that clear.
Not at you.
So,
We love you.
but the thing is, it could always be worse, right? I mean, so now you think it's like zigzagging all over the place, and yet you've got a fairly stable commission in terms of what its membership is, with commissioners only being removable for cause and serving 5-year terms. And so I would actually argue that, in a way, FERC was set up by Congress to make change in an incremental fashion. So if you're looking for an agency that does things in a radically different way, like very quickly, it's hard for FERC to do that. And it should be hard for FERC to do that. And really, when you even look at FERC's, like, what they call their landmark orders, almost always they build up over time based on precedent. Like Order 888 didn't come out of the blue, right? I mean, it was based upon some rulemakings in the natural gas industry. FERC saw what worked, it saw what didn't work, and then used that and issued Rule 888. So FERC is kind of set up that way, and I actually think that there can be some value to it. Now, where I think the difficulty comes in is when you're dealing with the dramatically evolving landscape like the one we have now, right?
Yeah.
And with, FERC trying to figure out transmission planning, starting with Order 1000 and now going to Order 1920 and 1928. This is where I think the model of incremental change has some difficulty, right? Because it's very hard within the authorities that FERC has to do something perhaps more transformative in nature. But partly that's because of FERC's authority under the Federal Power Act and the fact that it doesn't have like some sort of centralized planning authority.
So, not to like moderate our own discussion, I'm sorry, Zach. But I think what we're actually talking about are sort of like three different lanes here, right? Like, and the one that we haven't gotten to yet is the one that I think about all the time. But we're talking about like one, setting the policy, right? And there are certain things, like when it comes to transmission, actually, right, the Trump administration's policy is not vastly different than the Biden administration's. It's like build transmission, right? And it made it into the 8-9 list of priorities from Secretary Wright. So like that in theory should be the same. But then you get into the process part of it, which is where I think Norman is saying like the process at FERC may need to evolve a little bit to meet the current timeline of changes happening. I know Secretary Granholm always, whenever we'd explain to her, okay, well they're gonna write a pre-rule, and then they're going to do hearings, and then we're going to have a rule, and then there's going to be like a rehearing, and then eventually there will be a final rule, but there might be a rehearing in that, and then there's a final rule, and then we do that all over again when we actually do the actual filings. And like her head would just explode at thinking about the time associated with that. But that is like a deliberative process that like is worth thinking about whether that is the right full timeline for everything going on. But then like, the thing that keeps me up at night now, and I've talked to both of them about, is like the personnel side as well, which I think is undergirding our assumptions about our ability to either meet process or policy moving forward, right? Just this week, the Department of Energy put out another deferred resignation offer, and our understanding is a lot of people are going to take it. And if those folks aren't there, right, some of these policies that we as an industry have come to rely on, right, like every generator in America feels better knowing that you have a 202C option, right, just in case. You don't need it all the time, but just in case. What happens if the personnel is not there to actually execute on something like that? Similarly, like you're waiting for certain permits from the federal government for wetlands or fish and wildlife. You know, that suddenly becomes a massive timeline risk for building some of these projects if there are just vastly fewer people who are doing that type of work. And so there's also like a prioritization within that personnel, right? One of the things we did when I was at the Department of Energy is I basically said, I have a concierge service. If you are trying to like get a permit from one of the other federal agencies, just call me and I will track it down and we will figure out what the problem is. And I think continuing to figure out who can prioritize some of those different pieces, right? FERC can't do that. That's not appropriate for FERC. But working hand in hand, we can find ways to accelerate if there's the right prioritization of those different parts coming together.
Thanks. Definitely some major personnel questions at DOE for sure. I do want to get to the National Energy Dominance Council because I do think that that's something that a lot of people have questions about, how it's going to function. The executive order establishing the council, it directs a study or a report within 100 days with recommendations on how agencies can use their existing authorities to boost energy production. The order does not specifically mention FERC, but Chairman Christie, he has said that he hopes that FERC is able to provide input and suggestions to the council as part of its work. Craig, from your perspective, are there any specific actions that the council could take to make the life of a grid operator like PJM easier, for example?
I think for, not just for us, but I think for the whole industry, I think this, look, they could screw this up, but it could be a really good thing to do. First of all, you're elevating the energy issue. The Secretary Burgum is also on the National Security Council, recognizing energy as a international security issue, which it is, so that's in and of itself, I think, important. But let me give an example of something some years ago and tell you a bit of a story about this. We were trying to build a line from Pennsylvania to New Jersey to alleviate significant congestion in northern New Jersey. And the Pennsylvania Commission approved the line. The New Jersey Board of Public Utilities approved the line. We needed to get through 5 miles of what was the Delaware River Water Gap, which is a national park right along the border between New Jersey and Pennsylvania. And the park ranger, who is the head of the park, refused to grant the permit to cross the 5 miles. And his argument was, even though it's, I mean, you know, I hope he does take the, and I don't want to say his name, but I hope he does take the buyout, actually, to be honest. My bitterness coming through here, but excuse me, sir.
We love
But-
public servants here.
But his point was, my statutory mission is to preserve and protect the park. So I don't have a statutory mission to promote energy transmission, to worry about reliability in New Jersey. Look, this is what I'm assigned to do. Show me the statute, that's his mission. So technically, he wasn't wrong. That was his mission. And, you know, those are the kinds of issues where if each agency has its own mission and fully and faithfully execute its mission, it's not going to work in the larger framework. So, I mean, DOE took efforts to deal with that. You can talk about coordination among agencies, but you got this mission problem of different missions that work at cross purposes. And to the extent this National Energy Dominance Council can say this overall policy really sort of has to imbue in every member's policy, it might help to solve some of those issues that I give an example of. So I have hope for it. I think it could be very positive, depending on how it plays out.
My dad is one of 9 kids, and every year at Christmas, they sit down and try to figure out who's going to contribute how much money to whatever cause it is that they're talking about this year, which is really lovely. And every year devolves into people arguing with each other because there's 9 of them. And like, I sort of think of interagency actions sometimes like that, of everyone really wants to get to the same outcome, but this gets really complicated very quickly. And I think some of these interagency aspects, unless there's a clear lead and there's a clear path forward and direction from the White House, it can get complicated quickly and get mired in some of the interagency squabbles.
Norman, anything to add there? Or?
You know, I agree with Craig that in theory, a lot of good could come from the National Energy Council if it has the right priorities. And so there clearly is possibility there. And now the question becomes, you know, whether or not that possibility is realized. And, you know, one of the other questions that you were going to ask me later actually ties into this, which is to say, you know, what could the administration do that would be helpful for developing transmission? In my view, one of the most important things it can do, and it doesn't even take an appropriation from Congress, is to recognize the importance and the value of transmission and to make its development a priority. I mean, just sending that message alone would be super helpful. Another thing that the administration could do would be to remove or to reduce regulatory uncertainty as much as possible. And unfortunately, there is a question mark over the Inflation Reduction Act and funds that were provided to DOE either under the IRA or the IIJA, and whether that funding is actually used. And that creates uncertainty, and it makes it very hard for developers of infrastructure to plan around, particularly if they've already started to do something. So there's some things that could be done that would be very helpful. And of course, a lot of people have mentioned permitting reform, and clearly that too could be helpful, as well as, you know, marshaling the other resources of the federal government, whether it's lands held by the BLM, whether it's offshore land as well. Regardless, right? I mean, there are many, many things that the administration could do, and that could truly help drive this plan of energy dominance, if that's the goal.
And Maria, coming back to you, we're more than 2 months into the new administration now, and we've obviously some major actions on trade policy, but we haven't really seen any specific actions to address supply chain bottlenecks for the transmission industry, which is obviously a major issue. How, from your view, how significant are those bottlenecks, and is there anything DOE could do to alleviate those, for example, under the Defense Production Act?
I've only had about 10 hours to really think about this after yesterday's announcement around tariffs, so that is not fully baked yet in my brain. Overall, so a couple of interesting points. The Trump administration revoked all of the Defense Production Act executive orders from the Biden administration except for one. There is one remaining standing, and that is for grid components, including but not limited to transformers, but anything that moves electrons in essence, and it's very wide-ranging in terms of the technology authority. The problem with the Defense Production Act is the way that it's currently set up leaves very little space for actual authorities, right? You can do some bulk purchasing or backstop, and that's reading it very literally. I think there's probably more ways to be creative with it. The other problem is there's no appropriations actually attached to that. So it becomes a question of what money are you using to be a backstop? I don't know about you, but I am not particularly bullish about Congress suddenly finding $5 billion to put towards that. But if they were, I think that could open up a couple of interesting lanes because at this point in time, right, I think for all sorts of different components that we need to deal with some of the energy emergency, you're looking at lead times 3, 5, 7 years out in order to build some of this, and we have needs immediately. I will continue until the end of time, tell the story. Oh, it was actually Denver. It was Denver, Colorado called, and it was their housing unit, and they said, we are desperately trying, we have everything together, and we are building a homeless shelter, because in Denver, that's very important. And what can you do to help get electricity hooked up faster for me? Because right now, we're getting wait times of 4 years. And then so I went down the rabbit hole, and it really was like a supply chain situation, right? Of course, Excel could hook them up faster, but it became like this larger supply chain issue. And to me, that is the difference between someone having a roof over their head or not. So this is a thing that we have to continue to keep pushing on, is figuring out how we get those supply chains to really work for us longer term, especially ones that are more archaic. Yes, we're talking about transformers, but we're not talking enough about circuit breakers. And I think that's part of it, of being really comprehensive and looking up and down the value chain to make some real change.
Yeah, I want to pick up on the Defense Production Act, a little bit of just background on that. Before I do that, though, if anybody's looked at the stock market recently,
I'm trying not to.
What it's doing on our 401ks, we may need to have next year's meeting at the Econo Lodge. So Larry, could you?
I'll be working longer.
All right. I think the Econo Lodge is available. I understand you may want to book it for this. What is this thing called Defense Production Act? This is the real Washington speak, but this was an act that was passed during the Truman administration, okay? And the idea was we were in the middle of the Korean War, and there was a need for steel to build tanks to fight the Korean War. And Truman tried to do this on his own, and Congress said, you can't do this on your own, and they passed this thing called the Defense Production Act that gives the president a vast authority to sort of prioritize different things that need to be made, if you will, prioritize contracts. In that case, it was for steel. President Biden used it for baby formula, remember that? Mm-hmm. But it is this vast authority, and it's interesting because it gets unlocked by a presidential declaration of an emergency. When the president took the first step, day one, he declared an energy emergency. That unlocks this vast authority on Defense Production Act. So that's the good news story. The bad news story, and we've had a lot of conversation with DOE, because we're worried about this for fuel situations. We can't get fuel to power plants. And 202C is not available. That's another story we should talk about. It's not available for that. I was pointed to the Defense Production Act, but it's very clunky. I may be the RTO, I see a region-wide fuel shortage, supply chain, transformer shortage, more than one utility across the entire region, or all of us RTOs may get together and say, we got a nationwide issue, but we can't apply under the Defense Production Act. Instead, each utility has to bring individual contracts to the DOE, and DOE has to sort through the terms of those contracts to prioritize them. So it's a very clunky statute as written for what it could be used for. I say that just a little bit of a pitch here. It is actually up for congressional reauthorization this year. And so there really is an opportunity here, if the industry could come together on this, for some surgical fixes to deal with sort of more of the procedural hangups, and particularly on issues like supply chain, transformers, cable, you name it. This is a powerful tool that could be used. So the president, he may issue an order next week, another executive order on coal, for example. But here's something that would be more long-lasting. It's a statute that may need some reform. So I just ask people, that's a little bit of the history of it. I think Maria gave you a good example of some of the problems as it exists. But I think just my plea to the whole industry is we ought to be going to Congress in a unified way to say, let's make this thing a little more nimble, to use my word again, and usable in some of the situations that we've got on supply chain issues.
And Craig, just staying with you since you just mentioned potential forthcoming action to support coal-fired generation. We've heard both Secretaries Burgum and Wright kind of hint at some sort of market-based mechanism to support both existing coal-fired generation and potentially even restart coal plants. We saw kind of a similar effort spearheaded by former Secretary DOE Secretary Rick Perry fail at FERC in 2017. Just in your view, are there any inherent challenges or hurdles that a proposal like that would face this time around?
Well, I don't know exactly what the executive order will say. It's kind of hard to bring back a closed coal plant, because the boilers have been mothballed, et cetera, if not torn down. You got issues about the capacity interconnection rights, et cetera. But for the existing fleet, I mean, I think it, certainly could be helpful to keeping that fleet around. The biggest challenge they've got is obviously the deadlines under the existing environmental laws. But this is going to be very bloody. This is not what 202C was designed for. 202C, which I should avoid doublespeak here, is a section of the Federal Power Act that gives the Secretary of Energy authority on a 90-day basis, short-term authority to declare an energy emergency for a specific set of power plants, to order them to run, and basically preempt the environmental laws, among others, even state permitting laws, I would think, to be able to run to deal with the emergency. The Secretary can renew it, but it was kind of a short-term thing. It's not a great authority to say, for the next 5 years, we're going to bring it back. And think of yourself, if you're a coal plant operator, thinking about whether you keep this plant running or not. On one hand, you say, look, I could harvest this plant for the extent of the Trump administration. Capacity prices are high. I could do pretty well. So why not keep it open? That's true. On the other hand, if the plant needs some investment, are you going to really bet, well, yeah, Trump's going to there'll be a third Trump term, or this effort will continue, or are we going to have, again, the flip-flop, and then you've wasted the investment. So I think it's a short-term fix. Doing this by executive order or 202C is not a great way to do it, but we'll see what he says.
And I think that industry could actually learn a lot from people, we don't talk about them a lot, but hydro, because hydro is kind of going through that right now as they're trying to figure out, do we relicense? Do we not relicense? Are we actually going to spend the money because it's absurdly expensive to make some of those improvements? And that should be a larger conversation that's happening amongst a variety of different generators as they're figuring that out, because that's a thing. That's another thing that keeps me up at night, is worrying that our hydro fleet isn't going to get relicensed and maintained enough for reliability purposes. And I don't know what we're going to do then.
Yeah, the only thing I would add on the coal issue is that if you believe in markets, not only the energy market, but the capacity market, that should be providing the signal to the plant operator in terms of whether or not it keeps running or whether it's out of the money and should retire. And so for there to be an intervention that says, look, even though the market signal is telling you otherwise, we are going to tell you to come back, that seems to be inconsistent with the theory behind competitive wholesale markets. And I think actually there may be a broader discussion even within the energy industry between like the natural gas industry and the coal industry, because as a prior panelist noted, the big enemy for coal became natural gas. That's why a lot of coal ended up retiring even during the first Trump administration. And so it's not clear what would happen if there were another battle between the coal industry and the gas industry at the political level, let alone at the economic level. And I think FERC actually prudently denied the fuel secure rulemaking in 2017 because for a number of reasons. It provided an undue preference to one set of resources and discriminated unduly against another set of resources. I think FERC very much followed its mandate under the Federal Power Act. And so at the end of the day, that will still be the standard that FERC has to use were it to evaluate another proposal from DOE that resulted from an executive order.
Yeah, I will say though, from a market point of view, right now, coal is in the money. We just cleared the capacity market, virtually everything cleared. Prices were very high. You just heard Lanny talking about, major, huge increase in the forecast. So if I'm a coal producer, particularly with a well-depreciated plant, things are looking pretty good right now. Short term, but things are looking pretty good right now. So the challenge has been the environmental requirements on that plant and perhaps the need just to put money into it, longer term, Maria's point. So I think if the order is targeted to those things as opposed to totally changing the market, I think it might be helpful from that point of view. I'll put aside the environmental issues, which I'm sure we'll hear a lot about. That would be helpful. You're right, though, if it suddenly says, we're going to jump in the market to save coal. I'm not sure the market isn't sending a signal right now that coal actually should stick around, because I think it is.
We're doing a horrible job talking about transmission. So I'm just saying.
Sort of transmission adjacent.
Let's pull us back.
So yeah, turning back to transmission then, Maria,
Very good.
are there any ongoing bipartisan infrastructure law funded or IRA funded transmission initiatives at DOE that the current administration could seek to retool or repurpose or otherwise harness to achieve their own policy goals?
Yeah, for sure. So I think part of this, let's put aside the personnel stuff because I think there are very serious personnel questions as to whether some of this money gets out the door that has nothing to do with whether they're meritorious grants or not, and they do or don't get canceled, right? If you were in GRIP 1, you're still getting paid, right? Those projects are still moving. GRIP 2, they're waiting, but for the most part, the understanding from all the many, many lists floating around Washington, D.C. these days is that GRIP 2 is not necessarily on the chopping block the way that you're seeing like some of the hydrogen hubs or some of the other things that are in there. And I'll note, and this gets really in the weeds from like a D.C. nonsense perspective, but the bipartisan infrastructure law was passed on a different basis in Congress than the Inflation Reduction Act. So clawing back money from the bipartisan infrastructure law doesn't necessarily help with reducing the amount of money that they need to raise in order to get to zero to do the tax cuts. So that may become like a relevant conversation later on versus like the IRA stuff does. And I think that's why you see EPA pushing hard on some of those IRA mechanisms right now. There's still a third round of GRIP money out there. And I really hope that the administration seriously considers how they want to use that, just because the investment is just so massive, right? We got we were 800% oversubscribed, and that was just from the people who actually sent in applications. We know that there are lots of places that didn't have the capacity to send in the application in order to do that work. And there's so much more that needs to happen on that end that I do think helps with cost allocation, right? Back to the point from previous conversations is like the cost allocation continues to be the problem. Trying to tie this together with one of the questions asked earlier about using the national laboratory sites for AI, right? If you go to Idaho Falls, which I actually encourage you to do, it's lovely, maybe not in March, you'll find out that the Idaho Falls co-op, or Muni, that is there, has been trying to update their substation for ages because they know that the Idaho National Lab is, using more power, it's growing. But obviously the other residents of Idaho Falls are not super excited about paying for a massive substation upgrade there. And they haven't found a way so that the Idaho National Lab can pay for it because they're a federal facility. So we're sitting here on this space where it's like a lot of this grid infrastructure needs to figure out how to get paid for. And you're not going to be able to put a data center in the middle of that unless you know who's going to pay for some of those grid upgrades associated. So I think that is going to continue to be in an area where having some amount of federal funding to help encourage everyone to get to yes is a really helpful mechanism. And we heard stories every day of different projects that got to yes without the federal funding because they realized it penciled just because everyone got together in the same room to have the conversation. So I think continuing to encourage that by throwing some amount of carrot out there is going to be really important to get the upgrades that we need at the pace at which we need it. So we're not sitting, having cost allocation arguments for 2 to 5 years for a project that only takes 1 to 2 years to build.
Yeah, I would say that in the end, it always comes down to the problem we all know too well when it comes to transmission, which is the 3 Ps, right? Paying, permitting, and planning. And the federal government clearly can help in each of those 3 areas. And really, if you were to talk about like the ultimate dream, like if this administration really wanted to build out the grid of the future, what I would say is that the president has an opportunity to build, if not the greatest kind of public works infrastructure in the history of the United States, the second greatest. Many people
It's the
say
greatest. It's the greatest. It's
okay.
better that way.
Well, many people say that the National Highway System is the greatest public works infrastructure ever built in the United States. And I don't know if you're familiar with the history of it. And if you are, I apologize for repeating it. But it's really fascinating because, during the Roosevelt administration, there was a recognition that the National Highway System had to be developed, and that under the current approach, each state was responsible for the roads within its borders, but not for other states, right, obviously. And it's because of the cost allocation issue, right? And so you had this mishmash of roads across the United States that didn't necessarily connect across state lines. So Roosevelt understood that the United States and its national economy needed a more rational set of highways. And so they actually planned for 3 big east-west lines and 3 big north-south lines. And when you go back to their planning models, those proposed lines or highways look very similar to what we currently have. Okay, so Roosevelt wanted to do this. He wasn't able to. Why? World War II. There wasn't any money to do this, right? And so the whole idea got put on a back shelf. And then Eisenhower became president, right? Eisenhower understood the importance of creating this national highway system, not only for the economy, but for national defense as well, and the way in which it could draw us together as a people. He had 2 sets of experiences that informed his view in terms of making this one of his administration's top priorities. One was that during, in 1919, as a young Army officer, the Pentagon, or the Department of Defense at the time, had this kind of experiment where they wanted to send troops from Washington, D.C. to San Francisco, and they wanted to see how easy or how hard it would be to do that. It took Eisenhower and this convoy of trucks like 2 months to cross the United States. I mean, they were going over unpaved roads at times, right? And so I think he learned a lot from that. And then in contrast, during World War II, when he was in Germany, he saw the marvels of the Autobahn, right? And he recognized that the United States needed a similar system. He makes it a priority for his administration. They put the funding in. He uses his political capital to get Congress to approve this. And thus, you know, our national highway system was built, right? And then that commitment to the national highway system continued through successive administrations. The Trump administration actually has the opportunity to do something equally transformative if it wishes to seize that opportunity. And I hope it does. And even if it doesn't go that far, there are plenty of things short of that which it could do.
I think I have time to squeeze in maybe just one more question before we open it up here. Just very quickly, are there any signs or markers that you'll be looking for within the next few months or maybe over the course of the next year that will show or kind of indicate whether the administration is committed to transmission?
I'm keeping my eyes peeled for the GRIP 3. I think that's going to be a big, important marker.
I'd look for the pronouncements from the members of the Energy Council, as well as follow what happens at FERC and what the priorities there are.
Yeah, I would second Norman's issues. I also think the issues around, from our last panel, the issues around data centers and data center load. Judge Christie has indicated he's going to take that on very aggressively now. And, you know, you've got an interesting situation where he's representing the independent FERC commission, worried about cost allocation, et cetera. You've got a push from the White House to say this is in the national interest. I think this is going to play out very soon, and let's see how that plays out. I think that's going to be a real indicator of how these pieces fit together between the FERC, the DOE, the White House, et cetera.
Great, yeah. Yeah, so we can go to the audience. Anyone have a question for the panelists?
There's a quiz on the history lesson that Norman gave, by the way.
Anybody?
Not a one.
We were so thorough.
No, it's lunchtime.
Yeah, I know.
Did you have any wrap-up questions, or?
If you have, I have a couple more that I could ask. Or
No, I think we're going to go ahead and bring it to a close. Just want to thank the panel for participating and for a very interesting discussion. One observation, Norman, you have great taste in socks. I can see. But with that, we're going to go ahead and wrap it up. I want to thank everybody for coming to the spring meeting. And we do have lunch available afterward here, so feel free to stop by and get something to eat. Thank you very much for being here.